So we've got our scene pretty close to blocked in as far as the street and the building and the sidewalk. I'm going to kind of step back away from the scene for a second and focus on, jump out here, this trash can. And there's also another one here, and there's another trash can here. They are perhaps deceptively simple to model once you know a little bit more about the array modifier. So that's what we're going to focus on for the next half an hour or so. And I want to clear up my scene. I still want to add this trash can to this scene, but I don't need to have any of this stuff visible right now. So I'm going to hit 2 on my keyboard, not on the number pad, but on my keyboard. So I go to layer 2 and Shift C to center my cursor. And now I'm kind of have a new scene, but it's you know, the other information is still there, but I've got a clean slate to start with for this trash can. So let's look at this trash can again real quick. Let's go to a better view. I believe if I jump up onto the sidewalk, I'll get a pretty good view of the trash can. Yeah, okay. So that's what we want to model. And the way that we're going to do this, again, is with the array modifier, and we only have to model kind of one of these vertical sections, and then we can use an array to spin duplicates of that around a center and create our form. Once we do that, the rest of it is just a series of cylinders scaled in various directions to create this band and the base, and even the actual can liner on the inside is just a cylinder. So let's get started. I've got my 3D cursor centered here, and I do that by hitting Shift C. And I'm going to start with a cube. So Shift A, add mesh, cube. First thing I'm going to do once I add my cube is I'm going to rename it, and I'm going to name it trash can. That's not how you spell it. There it is. Trash can. I hit tab to go into edit mode. I'm going to jump into vertex select mode because that's what I like to work with by default. 1 to go into front view. Period on the number pad to center up the geometry. And I want to move it up so that the origin is at the bottom of the cube. So just like we did with the building, I'm going to hit, with everything selected, I'm going to hit G, Z, and 1. And now my origin, which is this big orange dot here, is level with the bottom of my cube. Okay. The next thing that I want to do is I want to start shaping this so that it looks like one of these bars right here. So the obvious one from front view is that I need to scale this down along the x-axis to be pretty skinny. And then I also want to look at the height. So this trash can, and from real experience with other trash cans in the world, they don't tend to be that tall. We'll say this one's about 3 feet tall to make it easy. So I will jump into Blender, and again, what we're working with is one Blender unit is about 1 meter, which is close enough to 3 feet for our purposes. So I'm going to, in wireframe mode, deselect everything and box select this top half, and I'm just going to move it down G, Z, 1 Blender unit. So GZ -1. And now it's the height that I want it. Now if I go to side view with 3, it's still 2 Blender units thick, which is about 6 feet thick, obviously way too thick. So I'm going to select everything, double tap A, and scale it along the y-axis. Scale it along the y-axis down pretty skinny to maybe there. And I think it's still probably a little too thick along the x-axis, so let's scale it along the x a little bit more, and maybe a little bit more along the y-axis. That looks pretty close, I think. Once we start adding the array, it'll be easier to tell. The next thing that I want to do is I want to worry about this curve right up here at the top. And the way that I'm going to do that, I'm going to side view, and I want it to curve up and out like this. So I'm going to delete that first. I'm going to select the top here, just the top 4 vertices. Then in side view, I'm going to hit E to extrude. I'm going to go up just a little bit. I'm going to hit R to rotate a little bit, and then I'm going to move it forward along the y-axis a little bit. And I'm going to do this a couple more times. Extrude, rotate, move, and one last time. Extrude, rotate. The last rotation I want to be pretty close to vertical, and then move to about there, I think. Looks pretty close. This is my shape. And actually, it might be a little bit too sharp of a curve. So the way that I can adjust that is I can select this edge loop and move it down a little bit. And I can select this edge loop, move it down a little bit, and just space these out a little bit more. And maybe move this one forward a little bit more. Oops. Box select that. Move that a little bit more so it just kind of smooths that out just a little bit. Okay. So I've got my basic shape, and I can always come back later and refine this a little bit more. I'll go back to front view. Okay, so I've got my basic shape. Now what I need to do is get it spinning around the center. So I know I want to use an array modifier, so I'll add that right now. Go to my modifiers panel, which is the wrench, add modifier, array. Now I'm going to look at my options. And the one that's important here is this object offset. What that means is that you can have your what determines how your object gets translated be determined by another object. Instead of being a fixed number or the object itself, which is what the relative offset is, you can have it be a separate object entirely. And that's what I want to do. So with my 3D cursor still centered at my geometry's origin, in which if it's not, I'm going to select my geometry in object mode and then hit Shift S, cursor to selected. And now my 3D cursor is at my geometry's origin. And I'm going to add in an empty, much like we did when we did the solar system. So Shift A, add empty, and we'll just go with plane axis or plane axes. And I'm immediately going to rename this empty trash can. Trash can underscore empty. Actually, I'm going to call it trash can array empty, just to be extra specific. Okay. Now I can select my trash can object again, and I'm going to set my object offset to this empty trash can array empty. And immediately you can see that nothing happens. I'm also going to turn off relative offset, but nothing happens. No matter where I adjust the count, I don't see any difference with my array. And that's because the empty actually isn't doing anything different than the original object, so it's just being duplicated on top of itself. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to rotate the empty. And I'm going to rotate, I'm going to go into top view with my empty selected in object mode, and I'm going to rotate 10 degrees. I'm going to type in 10, and I'm going to hit enter. Okay. Now if I look at my object, I can see that there's a second one in there, but it's not really looking quite the way I want it to. And that's because the center of my trash can is right next to where the geometry is. And if I look at this actual trash can, the center of the trash can is probably about a foot and a half away from where these bars are. So that's what I want to do next. I'm going to, with my trash can object selected, I'm going to hit Tab to go into edit mode. I'm going to select everything, and then I will, let's go into top view to move this out. And I'm going to move it along the y-axis, and we'll move it back about, we'll say about -0.4 to right about there. Okay. Now you can start to see how this is working. Is these are the array is rotating these objects around my object offset, which in this case is the empty. So I've got the empty rotated 10 degrees, which means every additional instance of this array is going to be rotated another 10 degrees around the center. Now we know a circle is 360 degrees and we're rotating 10 degrees, so we want 36 for our count. And there is the tough part of the trash can done. Okay. Once you know it, it's simple, but getting there at first can be a little bit tricky. So I'm going to look at this from a few different angles and just kind of feel out the dimensions of it. It seems a little bit fat right now, so I'm going to, from top view, I'm going to G, Y, and I'm just going to move this in just a little bit. And that feels better. If I hit 5 to look at it in perspective view, that feels pretty close to this. It might be, I hit 5 to go back into orthographic. The bars themselves might be a little bit thick. So if I disable the array modifier for a second by just clicking this I, so I can only see this one instance again. From side view, I'm going to hit SY, and I'm just going to scale it in just a little bit more. Actually, no, I'm not going to do that because it's distorting this curve a little bit. So instead, I will select these two vertices and these two vertices. Okay, so it's just this back face, and I will move that in along the y-axis. G, Y, just a little bit to thin that out. Okay, maybe a little bit more. And then I'll select these and move them forward to maintain my curve a bit more. And then these two as well. Okay. And that distorts it a little bit more than I'd like. I'll play around with it a little bit just to get the shape that I want. Select those two, maybe bring them up like that. And then maybe select these two, bring them up a little bit. Oops. Just a little bit. Okay. I'm okay with that. Now if I turn my array back on, everything else is thinner. You can see this again more obviously if with the array on. If you just start kind of moving vertices around, you can see that it affects all of them. So again, the array modifier is once again a very powerful tool to make complex things relatively simple. So that's the tough part of this trash can. The next thing that I want to do is I'm going to worry about this band right here, and then the band at the bottom, which is also the base. So if you're having trouble with unexpected scaling, it's like if you're getting something where your scales are off like this, it's because you scaled in object mode. So what you need to do is hit Object in your menu down here, Apply, and Scale, and then that will bring everything back to the right size. You also need to make sure that your origin for both your empty and your geometry are in the same spot. So if you hit Shift-C, which centers your cursor, then you can select your object and click Origin to 3D Cursor, and that will center everything back up. And once they're in the same spot and the scales are applied, then you should be okay. All right, so I've got the general form of these bars the way that I want for the trash can. The next thing that I want to do is this bar right around here, and the way that I'm going to do that is with my cursor still centered, which again hit Shift-C to make sure it's centered. In top view, I'm going to hit Shift-A, Add Mesh, cylinder, and then immediately I'm going to hit F6, and I'll change my vertices down to 12, and then I'll hit enter. Okay. Now I added this as its own object, and that's because if I added it in the same object as the rest of it, then the array would be applied to that as well, and things would get really messy. So I don't want to do that. I do, however, want to name this, and I'll name this trashcan underscore bands, and then I'm going to hit tab to go into edit mode, and I'm going to scale this down to just outside the radius. Let's hit, I'll say right about there, and then I'm going to from front view scale it along the z-axis to about, so maybe there, I think. It looks about the right size, and then I'll G and Z and move it up to about there. Okay. Yeah, I think that looks all right. Now you'll notice that there's a face that goes throughout the whole thing, which I do not want. So what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to go into face select mode, and I'll select that face, and I will delete that, and I'll select the face underneath it and delete that. So now I just have this band of faces around the edge. So I can select all of that, and then in top view I'm going to hit E to extrude, right click to keep that extrusion in the same spot, and then scale it down just a little bit, just so it meets the inside thickness. And actually I'm going to undo that scale for a second. If you look, if I scale this, as I scale it up it gets fatter, which means as I scale it down it's going to get skinnier. I don't want that, so when I scale I'm going to hit Shift Z so that it does not scale along the Z axis. I only want it to scale along the X and Y, and I'll scale it down maybe that much just so it's on the inside. Yeah, I think that's okay. And yeah, now this looks a little bit blocky right now, and that's because I haven't added a subsurface modifier yet, but we can get to that a little bit later. Now that I have this band, this is basically the same as this one down here. So I'm going to, with everything selected, double tap A, I'm going to go into front view and hit Shift D to duplicate it, right click to keep it in place, and then G, Z, and move it down to the bottom. And I'll move it so it just slightly overlaps the bars. Again, G, Z to lock it to that axis, and we'll say right about there. And go into front view, and that looks pretty good. Now the next thing, you can't really see the underside of the trash can, so this is where you get to kind of exercise a little bit of creative license. I think there's another trash can over here somewhere that you still can't really see that well. But what I'm going to do, the first thing is I'm going to delete these faces on the underside. I don't need them. So in face select mode, if I option right click on one of these cross edges, it will select the whole face loop, and that's what I want. I'm going to select the whole face loop, option right click, and hit X and delete the faces, and that leaves me with this open side underneath. Okay, now I'm going to go into vertex select mode, option right click on this outside edge, and this is what I'm going to extrude around to complete my form. So from front view, and I'm going to hit Z to do this in wireframe. I'm going to hit E to extrude, Z to lock it to the Z axis. I'm going to extrude it down a little bit. Then I'll extrude again, right click to keep it in place, and scale it in a little bit. Okay, so this gives me this shape here. And that I may have scaled that a little too far, so I'm going to scale it back up, and I'm just hitting S to scale. Because all of these vertices are on the same plane, I don't have to worry about them getting out of whack vertically. They'll scale smoothly from the center, as long as I make sure that I'm down here I'm in either individual origins or bounding box center. And that's comma on your keyboard will make sure you're scaling to the bounding box center. So I've made this form here, and then I'm going to extrude it again in the Z direction, because I just want to go straight down to about maybe here. that looks good. And then I'm going to extrude it one more time, right click to keep it in the same spot and scale it in. And that's my bottom. That's all I'm going to do for the bottom. Anything on the inside is going to be hidden when we do this inner actual can next time. But that's pretty good for now. So just to test, if I add a subdivision surface modifier here, you can see that these sizes look pretty close. And this is where, and we can actually just do this now. I set my views to 2 and optimal display on. This is where we need to add something called detail loops. And those are extra edge loops that help define harder edges. So if I hit Control R, and I'm going to scroll wheel up once so that I'm adding 2 edge loops, and I'm going to right click to keep them in the center. You can see that this edge got a little bit sharper. Now if with these 2 edge loops still selected, if I scale it up along the z-axis, I can push them to the edges and I'll make that edge even harder. And this is something that, again, I will do around the whole thing. Oops. I can add an edge loop here, drag it to the edge. I can add another edge loop here, drag it to the edge. And then I'll do the same thing on the underside. A couple more there, and a couple more on the inside. Again, I'll add 2 edge loops, right click to keep them in the center, and scale it up along the z-axis so they're even. Okay, whoops. There we go. Okay. Now if I select everything, and you can see it kind of, it's not quite as far out as it was before. So I'm going to select everything and scale it again, hitting Shift Z so it doesn't scale vertically, and just scale it out a little bit so I've got that overlap that I want. Okay. And I added a group somehow, so I'm going to remove that group. Okay. And then if I, in object mode, my toolbar, hit smooth shading, now I get what I want. So that's the basics of how to get the form for the trash can. There's only other thing left to do is smooth out the bottom and then add this inner can lining, which we'll do next time. Okay, that's it.